Um, Welcome back, everybody. We've had a brief break in our series of online lectures dealing with various aspects of sporting art. But we've now arranged 3 lectures for this summer, and we're currently putting on a program for the autumn. If anybody's got any ideas as to potential speakers or subjects you would like covered, please let us know. This is the 27th session of our series of online talks. And I continue to thank Jamie Rountree of the Rountree Tryon Gallery, who has agreed to continue sponsoring this series. As I've said before, it means that we can continue to put on these talks for free. And it also means that non-members, more importantly, future members, can join us. Again, we're recording this talk for future reference, and I'd like to remind you that you can access all our previous talks through the BSAT website. Today, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Nick Clee. I've known Nicholas for many years, and I've watched the Oaks at Epsom with him for probably 10 years now. Sadly, a series interrupted by COVID. But it's appropriate that Nick should be talking about Eclipse today, as Eclipse started his career at Epsom. Nick is an author of 2 books, one on Eclipse, the story of the Rogue, the Madam and the Horse that changed racing, published, I see, in 2009, but very well received when it was published. And also last year published Courses for Horses, A Journey Around Racing in Britain and Ireland, which I encourage you to find on the internet. A former editor of the Bookseller magazine, he's joint editor of the book industry newsletter Book Brunch, so he's well versed in the world of publishing. He's judged literary awards, including the Booker Prize, and reviews books for the Times Literary Supplement and Literary Review. As usual in these talks, Nick has agreed to answer questions from you. The procedure is you type Q&A, you push the button at the Q&A, type your question, which is at the bottom of the screen. You type the questions and I put the questions to Nick at the end of his talk so we don't interrupt him. So, Nick.
Thanks very much, Tim, and welcome everybody. Thanks very much for joining me this afternoon. It was a great privilege, really, to write this book about Eclipse, the icon in horse racing. And it brought with it privileges, such as being able legitimately to use a glorious Stubbs portrait on the jacket, because that is indeed Eclipse. The bottom picture, perhaps less relevant, I think that was probably painted about 40 years before Eclipse raced. My publisher wasn't really particularly bothered about any anachronisms in the design, and perhaps there weren't many in those. There wasn't a great deal of change in those 40 years. Let's see the full picture. That portrait on my jacket is a detail from this picture, which is of William Wildman on the right in the green, and his 2 sons with Eclipse, painted by Stubbs, we think in 1769. It's a lovely picture, informal, unusual in Stubbs's work, unique, as described by Judy Edgerton, the great Stubbs expert. And I'll come back to say a bit more about this, and certainly say more about Wildman. What I'm going to do is outline to you Eclipse's story, which is an extraordinary one, quite unlike what you would expect of the supreme race horse in the sport of kings in the mid-18th century. and also to say something about Stubbs and other artists and Eclipse, and a bit about Stubbs's technique and about Eclipse's legacy. So let's begin at the beginning with this man, voted by readers of BBC history as the worst Briton of the 18th century. He is William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, the third son of George II, notorious because of the way he conducted the campaign against Prince Charlie at the Battle of Culloden and its aftermath in 1766. Augustus Cumberland relentlessly pursued his enemies, sympathizers with Prince Charlie and others, hanged many, shot many, deported many. He was a scourge of the north, and he's known in Scotland most usually as Butcher Cumberland. Some years after this, 11 years after this, he was defeated at the Battle of Dettingen, which was during the 7 Years' War, and came home to the supportive words from his father that he'd ruined his country and his army and made himself, ruined his own reputation. Supportive dad. Cumberland resigned from the army after this, withering, summing up, and devoted himself to country pursuits, hunting, and in particular breeding horses. And he was remarkably perspicacious or lucky, who knows, perspicacious, I think, in that he bred not one but two great horses, the first being called Herod, great horse in the 1760s, and thereafter an outstanding stallion. Herod's son, who was called High Flyer, had sons and daughters who were mated with Eclipse's sons and daughters, and they produced many of the greatest racers of the late 17th and early 18th century. But Cumberland, who enjoyed the high life, ruined his health. And he died in 1765. There was a dispersal sale at which William Wildman, not a member of the nobility, but a meat trader at Smithfield Market, bought him for the sum of 45 guineas. Is often reported as 70 or 75 guineas, but Tim Cox, my assiduous research assistant, discovered the sale note. 45 guineas. Wildman took Eclipse back to his stables in Mickleham in Surrey. The horse was very unruly, but did not race until he was 5 years old. This was quite common at the time because races were so grueling. I'll say a bit more about that fairly soon. Wildman, like Cumberland, was associated with two great horses. The first being Gimcrack, who was also painted by Stubbs, and whose name endures in the Gimcrack Stakes at York, and there's a Gimcrack stand there as well. And the second, of course, being Eclipse. Eclipse began training on the Surrey Downs, and the time came in 1769 for him to face his first race with a trial on Epsom Downs. Now, we enter the realm of legends, as we do with quite a few stories about Eclipse and his owner. But the legend has it that touts, meaning betters and layers, came down to see the trial, but were too late. But found an old lady on the downs and asked if she'd seen the trial. And she said she wasn't sure whether she had, but she'd seen one horse racing ahead of another horse, and she didn't think the other horse would ever catch the first one, and even if they raced to the ends of the world. Whatever, it seems that word got out about Eclipse's ability, and he wasn't really much of a betting proposition when he began his first race, which was a nobleman's and gentleman's plate at Epsom, where he had 4 or 5 opponents. Racing in those days, you would either have a match race or you would have racing in heats. If you raced in heats, you'd race for usually 4 miles. And if the opposition was still in touching distance of you and you passed the post first, you'd race again over 4 miles. And if you won the second race, you would win that race overall. If you distanced the horses, in other words, if you were 240 yards ahead of them, and they hadn't passed what was known as the distance post, by the time you had passed the finish, you won as well, or as many horses as hadn't passed that post as you passed the finish would be eliminated. So enter Dennis O'Kelly. Dennis was an Irish chancer and rogue who had come to London to seek his fortune. He'd made it mostly by gambling, but he was for a while a chairman by repute. Anyway, someone who carried the front legs, back legs, I can't remember which they said Dennis carried, of the chairs around which the wealthy would be transported. He fell into financial difficulties and spent time in the Fleet prison. But when he came out, his fortune started to improve, perhaps thanks to his mistress, whom we'll meet very soon. Also thanks to his prowess as a gambler. And towards the end of the 1760s, he began to take an interest in buying horses. Here he is in a later picture by Rowlandson called The Betting Post. In those days, there was no betting ring. There were no bookmakers who had to quote prices about every horse in a race. There were private individuals making bets with each other. On the left, you can see the Prince of Wales in the red coat. He is the one striking a bet at that moment. As I say, this is a slightly later picture. O'Kelly and the Prince knew each other. The Prince was a guest at O'Kelly's house in Epsom. Nevertheless, class system being what it is, O'Kelly was never quite accepted into the higher echelons of society, and certainly not into the Jockey Club, which was then owned by almost entirely landowning or titled individuals. Anyway, back to O'Kelly at the betting post. He struck a bet. and uttered the famous phrase, "Eclipse first and the rest nowhere." Nowhere being, by his definition, beyond the distance post once Eclipse had passed the post, the winning post. And his bet came good. By the time Eclipse had run his third race, O'Kelly had bought a share in him. And towards the end, or perhaps towards the beginning of the 1770 season, he bought the horse outright. There is O'Kelly again. This at the betting post. You can see the theme of the bulky O'Kelly weighing down a poor horse is one that was used regularly, though this is by an artist called Mansur. It's called the Eclipse Macaroni. A macaroni was a dandy or fine fellow. I think the title must have been ironic, given O'Kelly's portly appearance and his huge coat and his tricorn hat, I think. Anyway, he doesn't conform to my idea of a dandy. Now, here's another Rowlandson picture of O'Kelly. This is called Dennis O'Kelly Making a Deal. And at first superficial glance, you think O'Kelly must be the gentleman on the right, showing off the horse to another gentleman, showing off a horse that he wishes to sell. But closer inspection, and you start to notice the gentleman with his back to you and the tricorn hat and the bulky overcoat. And he's talking to the jockey. Perhaps he's making some sort of deal with the jockey. Should the jockey win the race, or would it be in O'Kelly's interest to lose the race? O'Kelly appears in quite a few Rowlandsons, and he's also always slightly detached from the action, keeping his own counsel. The impression is that he's a canny operator. Now, when O'Kelly was in the Fleet prison, he met a woman called Charlotte Hayes, who was a brothel madam. And they hit it off in a big way. And they left the Fleet prison at the same time in 1761. Dennis had been there for 5 years. They left in 1761. There was an amnesty or a pardon of some sort. Anyway, both Charlotte and O'Kelly made their ways up in the world. Charlotte had an establishment in Marlborough Street, Soho, and then she moved to the even more prestigious address of, was it called Pall Mall Place, or perhaps it's called that now? At any rate, you can see out of the window in the background, there is St. James's Palace. So perhaps this lady is expecting a royal visitor. Charlotte was notorious figure of her day, about whom people loved to write verses and squibs and scandalous newspaper reports and sometimes even books. She was known as the First Lady Abbess of the town, and her charges were known as nuns. These days, I think it's all too easy to see the story of Charlotte and her contemporaries as a sort of jolly good romp. Of course, really, the lives of most prostitutes were absolutely miserable, and they never came to a good end, except in a few cases. For instance, the prostitute Elizabeth Armistead married Charles James Fox, prominent Whig politician. Charlotte had a long life and no doubt made very wealthy about it, but she was a spendthrift as well. And she was to land in the Fleet prison some years later, even though there was plenty of money behind her. And she, Charlotte, would entertain with O'Kelly at his house in Epsom. O'Kelly had two houses in Epsom. He had racecourse stables, and you can see where they are if you're in the Epsom stands. They're in Downes House, which is just outside the rails, near the 1 mile 2 furlong start, and through the bushes at Epsom. I've been round there, and the barn, which one likes to believe that Eclipse inhabited, is still there. There's a more modern house there. This is Eclipse in a less distinguished painting by Sartorius. It's called Eclipse Walking the Course for the King's Plate. It was painted apparently in 1769, and Eclipse walked the course twice for King's Plates during that year, once at Canterbury and once at Salisbury. Perhaps this is Salisbury Downland, who knows? Doesn't really matter. One interesting thing is that you can see posts all the way up the course. It's very steep. And so it does appear that walking the course was literally what you did, whereas if a horse walks the course today, as one did not so long ago, actually, I think at Warwick, all the horse and the rider are obliged to do is go to the furlong marker and canter back past the judge's box. Eclipse walked the course 8 times during a career of 18 races, all of which he won. So opponents were reluctant to meet him, which may be why O'Kelly retired him at the end of the 1770 season. It may also be that O'Kelly was ahead of his time in realizing that the real money in racing was not to be made on the course, but in the breeding shed afterwards. Eclipse would cover, and let's move on to the next picture. Eclipse at stud would cover 50 to 60 mares per season at a fee of 40 to 50 guineas, if memory serves me right. So you can see at the time that was an awful lot of money. This is a picture of Eclipse at stud by a painter called Garrard. At first you think, well, this is far less skillful than the Stubbs pictures we've seen, and it is. But the bulkiness of Eclipse in this picture actually is a reflection, really, of what horses look like at stud. They develop sort of bull necks, and they look incredibly powerful. Eclipse at stud was a great success, but he sired some 350 horses who went on to win on the racecourse. He was never champion sire for various reasons, one of which I think is that members of the Jockey Club didn't patronize him. Or most of them didn't anyway. In particular, Sir Charles Bunbury, who was sort of head of the Jockey Club, disapproved of O'Kelly, and is thought to be the person who most responsible for O'Kelly's lack of admission to the club. Bunbury didn't mind, though, whom he blackballed later in the 1790s. he told the Prince of Wales that he had to get rid of a jockey called Samuel Chifney, who had been accused of sharp practice when riding a horse called Escape. And he had told the prince that no gentleman in Newmarket would race against him unless he, the prince, dismissed Chifney. So, you know, you could be ever so grand, but you were, the jockey club still thought you needed putting in your place. Eclipse's male line, the line about this I've used in my book, is responsible for 95% of thoroughbreds racing today. I suspect it may be higher now. The Eclipse line, which is come through Sadler's Wells and Galileo, and more recently Frankel, is really quite dominant in the Blackstock world. Whether this means that the Eclipse genetic influence is great is a moot point. Genetic influence tends to diminish quite rapidly as you go through the generations. On the other hand, if you look at Eclipse's family tree, or rather family trees of horses descended from Eclipse, you'll see, of course, that because he was a successful sire, many of his sons and daughters went on to themselves occupy the breeding sheds, and they produced many more sons and daughters, with the result that the Eclipse line is apparent through many different lines of a horse's pedigree. Now, genes are shuffled at conception, and half your genetic material comes from your mother and half from your dad. So you could say that Eclipse's dam, well, you certainly could say, because it's truth, Eclipse's dam Spilessa appears in as many pedigrees as does Eclipse himself. What I like to think, because I like to think that one sees Eclipse's influence still nowadays, is that the reason horses are successful sires is that they are successful at passing on their best qualities to their offspring. Not only that, but they may be responsible for passing on the ability to pass on the best abilities to your offspring. I hope there aren't any geneticists among the audience, because I wouldn't be surprised if I got shot down for saying that. But anyway, the point is that every thoroughbred racing today is descended from Eclipse many times over. And we're talking hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. It's like the grains of wheat on the chessboard in the biblical story that double at every square you put them on. Now, we're returning to Stubbs and Eclipse. This is a study, as you can see, by Stubbs of Eclipse. It sits in the Royal Veterinary College and was the gift of Paul Mellon, himself the owner of a great Derby winner, Mill Reef. It's one of only two such studies that survive in Stubbs's oeuvre. But Judy Edgerton thinks that there may have been at one time many more. In other words, this was Stubbs's common practice to paint the horse from the life in situ and then put in the background, as in this. And as you can see, the pose is the same, even if the colors in this reproduction are somewhat different. This picture is in Baltimore now. It got in rather a sorry state, I gather, and has been restored. Judy Edgerton says that this picture is, she again describes this as unique in Stubbs's work. And what she means is that she describes it as conversation piece. In other words, a picture that shows people relaxed rather than formal poses. Wildman and Stubbs knew each other, it is clear. And Wildman may be a figure in sequence of paintings by Stubbs of hunters on the Duke of Portland's estate. And the reason why this has an informality that's unusual, if not unique, in Stubbs's work is probably because Stubbs and Wildman met as equals. They were not gentry. Now let's see another example of Stubbs's technique. Here are the 4 Mile stables at Newmarket. 4 miles because that was the length of the course. It's called the Beacon course. We've seen Stubbs's portrait of Eclipse, put that together with this, and again, albeit with colors that look different in these reproductions, you get this. This is Eclipse before one of his greatest races against a horse called Bucephalus. And it was 4 miles from roughly this point to roughly a couple of 100 yards beyond where the stand on the Newmarket Rally Mile course is now. Toughest race of his career, still. Eclipse went on to win 8 more races, whereas Bucephalus but got to the bottom of him trying to beat tried to beat Eclipse, and he didn't race again. This is Eclipse with a groom and jockey. Jockey identification, very hard. According to a note going with this painting, which by the way is a copy that Stubbs made of an original in 1770. And this copy is in the Jockey Club rooms in Newmarket. The 1770 version is in private hands. Anyway, the note with us says that the jockey was called Samuel Merritt. It gets complicated. You'll see that Merritt perhaps is wearing the same colours as have been apparent in other pictures of Eclipse. And O'Kelly took over those colours as well as Eclipse the racehorse when he bought the horse. Now, this is a picture, again, you recognize the colours and chestnut coat by John Nost Sartorius. And John Nost said that his father had painted Eclipse from the life. Well, that looks a bit like a copy of a Stubbs to me. The pose is so similar, isn't it? And let me show you one more. Well, he looks like a bay, but the markings are eclipses. And it looks like what Sartorius has done is just the sort of painterly equivalent of the photographic habit of flipping. So he's just turned him round. Now I include this picture. This is Stubbs, and this is Baronet, who was owned by the Prince of Wales. Now, Eclipse, O'Kelly died in 1787, and Eclipse died in 1789. And he was anatomized by a man called Charles Vial de Saint-Bel, because Saint-Bel wanted to set up a Royal Veterinary College, and he thought this would be a kind of calling card, a qualification anyway for doing so. But it was he who suggested that when a horse is at gallop, all four legs leave the ground. This is, we think, the first example showing that. Baronet's hind legs are off the ground there. This picture was hugely influential among equine artists. What they didn't know, and what you suspect Stubbs felt there was something wrong with this pose. What they didn't know, and wouldn't be shown until Muybridge's photographic experiments some century later, is that the point at which the horse's legs are off the ground is not when they're stretching, but when they're tucked underneath. And just this morning, I saw this as an illustration. These are the horses that escaped from Hyde Park Barracks last night. By the way, I lifted this from a newspaper report. I think I've engaged in quite a bit of dodgy copyright practice when preparing these slides. So let's hope we don't get caught. Finally, Eclipse's flesh was buried at Cannons in Edgware, where O'Kelly had moved. Cannons is now the site of the North London Collegiate School. By repute, portions of his skin survive, and you may see a framed portion in this picture next to the skeleton. Above that, this is from the Jockey Club rooms, above that is a whip supposed to contain hairs from Eclipse's tail. Below that is a hoof donated by William IV to the Jockey Club. There were supposed to be two hooves in royal possession, and at the beginning of the 20th century, Lord Knollys confirmed that there was one in the possession of Edward VII. Some years after writing this book, I gave a talk at Cumberland Lodge, and I sat next to the Ranger of Windsor Great Park, which Cumberland had been. He'd occupied that post. Anyway, I told him about the hoof and asked him if, said I didn't know whether there was one in royal possession. He said, quite casually, he said, oh, I'll ask the Queen. So he did, and she said there wasn't one. And she had a pretty good grasp of what, by repute, of what was in her private collection. So perhaps others can account for all four hooves these days. At one time, there were a good 7 or 8 knocking about. Above is Eclipse's skeleton. And that's been on many wanderings, but it's now in the Eclipse building. There's an Eclipse room at the Royal Veterinary College. This being appropriate because of Eclipse and Sam Bell's role in the founding of the cottage. Been on many wanderings, this skeleton, at one point just being kept in a dusty basement. Nevertheless, and in spite of all claims made for various artifacts belonging to the horse, it does appear, as a result of genetic examination, that this entire skeleton is indeed Eclipse's. I went to the veterinary college and I spoke to a very nice woman called Renata Weller, who has a replica in her office of Eclipse's humerus, and she uses as a paperweight. She wasn't, by the way, totally impressed by Stubbs's portrait of the horse. She said a lot of the angles were all wrong. Anyway, I haven't let her put me off. I still remain hugely enthusiastic about this horse, indeed enamored with it. And I hope to have passed on some of my enthusiasm this afternoon. So if you have any questions, do ask them. It's a while since I read this book, So I'll try to answer them, but I may have to resort to my copy of it to give you
Nick,
my
thank you very much for that talk and for going through both the pictures of Eclipse, of which there are many, and his influence on thoroughbred racing. Most interesting. And if anybody can get hold of the book, I hope it's still around. It's obviously going to be in the second-hand trade. It's a good read and enlightening about what is the most influential stallion in the thoroughbred breed. So thank you, Nick. On to questions. One question from Karen Hladek in America was pointing out that the picture at the bottom of your book cover is of the nobleman and gentleman's plate at Newmarket by Wootton. It's hanging in the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge. And it's one of a series of pictures of similar kind painted by Wootton. We need to identify which of the nobleman and gentleman's plates it is, but we can't quite get all the details to fit. But she
I think
asked
it was, wasn't it, 1720s?
Yes, well, probably, yes.
Yeah.
And she was asking whether these early paintings have been useful in understanding the development of racing in the late 18th century.
Yes, it took me a while to make sense of these pictures because in a number of them, you see a kind of riot of horses charging across the heath or the downs or wherever. It's only as you look at them for a bit that you realize that only 4 or 5 of them are written by jockeys wearing colours. The others are being ridden by gentlemen, probably with financial interests in the race, and they're sort of whipping them in and racing alongside. So it gives you a sense, I think, looking at these pictures, of how racing worked, how apparently chaotic it was. It's also emphasized its difference from races such as the Derby that came in not many years later. In fact, 3 of the first 5 Derby winners were sons of Eclipse, but this was a race originally over a mile, later as the Grand Prix over a mile and a half. But it's not the kind of race in which you get gentlemen on their own horses whipping the others in. Everything has become much more regulated.
One of the points I would add is that at Newmarket in the 1720s, when that picture was painted, most of the races were match races, as you'd said earlier, and that was one man against one man. I bet my £1,000 or 1,000 guineas that my horse is faster than yours. So they were racing for equal sums of money. And then they started to introduce these stakes races where for lower stakes, you could win higher prize money. So 10 people putting in 100 gave you 1,000, whereas you weren't risking your own 1,000 each time you raced. So that was one of the significant or important parts of that earlier picture. I know when you were writing the book that you charged all over the country in record offices. I remember you charging up to Hull in the middle of winter. And I just wondered whether you found out more that you didn't put in the book. I'm also particularly interested in, there's one horse whose skeleton is at Newmarket called Potatoes, who is the, if 95% of horses come from Eclipse, 85 come through his son Potatoes.
Yeah.
And Potatoes was in the stud just outside Newmarket. All his other companions at stud were marched off to Cheshire, but he stayed behind because he was infirm. I'm assuming Stubbs painted Potatoes.
I don't think he did, but I could be wrong. I might have. I'm wary of getting down Judy Edgerton's book because it weighs a ton, but I don't remember seeing a picture of Potatoes.
No, there isn't. No, we haven't found the picture of Potatoes.
I see.
Whether you're charging around the country in research gave you any clues as to whether he might have done.
I don't remember anything like that. No, sorry. That's a shame, isn't it?
It is.
The other line is through King Fergus, but I think that's sort of dying out, isn't it, that line?
Yes, I mean, it's the Potatoes line that is the one that's continuing.
Yeah.
But were there other lines of inquiry that you stimulated while you were writing the book that you didn't pursue or didn't think worth pursuing?
Well, actually, perhaps not so much of interest to this audience, but I was frustrated that I couldn't find a record of the death of Charlotte Hayes. I looked in various archives and just couldn't find it. Whereas, O'Kelly's will and his nephew Andrew, Dennis O'Kelly's will, they are in queue. We know about O'Kelly's death, of course. There are records showing Charlotte Hayes and Dennis O'Kelly in the Fleet prison, and there are records describing the effects they declared when they left the Fleet prison. But that was one thing I couldn't find. I don't remember. The other thing that was not really conclusively solved was the issue of whether the skeleton was Eclipse's. But I think since then it has been confirmed to be Eclipse's. What has also changed by as a result of work by the same researchers is that there is a fault in the generally accepted pedigree that you'll remember the names of the horses, Tim, but one Derby winner declared as one horse was in fact a different horse and went on to be influential at stud. And because every pedigree would have to be changed to reflect this discovery, Weatherby's has left us alone. So
I think Weatherby's have introduced a rule that the pedigrees are what we say they are.
Yeah.
And they're not prepared to change. And I think it's the litigious world, particularly in America, if we suddenly started to find some of these early pedigrees were not as they were purported to be, then breeders would be open to legal cases if a particular horse turned out to be a dud. Right. And I think it's that worry that has forced that. The horse you're thinking about is Bendor. I think it's the 81 Derby, who turned out in the end to not be Bendor, but to be Tadcaster.
Yes. And all the pedigrees say Bendor, don't they?
They do, yeah.
And that's the Eclipse. That's the Eclipse male line.
And they will continue to say Bendor. Right, Nick. I think that's our time is coming to an end.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, for putting your reminding yourself of all that work you did. So, well, 14 years ago. It was an exciting project, which I think did unearth new facts about Eclipse.
Well, most of them unearthed by you, Tim. I'm not sure I can claim the credit,
I
but
wasn't
you were
saying
very,
that.
very generous about it.
You had confidence in my research work. Anyway, thank you for that, and thank you for this afternoon. And just to let everybody know, our next talk will be on the 4th of June, again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Our speaker presenter will be Tanya Still, the artist, and she will be talking about her career and why she is so passionate about painting hounds and hunting scenes. So, Nick, thank you very much for this afternoon. And we welcome everybody back again on the 4th of June when we'll be discussing things with Tanya Still. So thank you very much and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.